May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Some of you may have seen or heard about the experiment that a couple of scientists did in 1999, where they got like 6 or 7 people together. Some of them had black t-shirts on and some of them had white t-shirts on, and they had a basketball. And they passed the basketball back and forth to each other. And your job, as you were watching, was to count the number of times that somebody in a white t-shirt passed the basketball. Be very careful. Now look, now watch. Number of times the person in a white t-shirt passed the basketball. And people would come back with various numbers of times the basketball was passed. 17, 19, 21. Almost half of the people observing this experiment did not see, literally did not see, the person in the gorilla suit come in front, pound their chest, and walk off. Don't see it. Now then somebody said, well, what about if you're carefully trained to look at the various details of an image? If you're very intense, and so they got a bunch of radiologists together, and they are very intense to look at x-rays to make sure they get the details, because you can see whether there's disease or not in the x-rays. So they got 24 radiologists from Brigham Women's Hospital in Boston to examine x-rays of people's lungs, to look for little white nodules on people's lungs. And they looked and they found the little white nodules, and they looked very carefully. 4 of them saw the silhouette of a gorilla that had been imposed on the x-rays. We see what we expect to see. We see what we are told to see. We notice what we want to see. And what we don't want to see, we may not remember. In the gospel lesson for today, Jesus meets a man named Bartimaeus who cannot see in the same way that most people can see. Now, this healing or giving sight to Bartimaeus concludes the section of the Gospel of Mark from which our gospel lesson for today has come and has been coming for the last several weeks. This section of the Gospel of Mark is called the Journey to Jerusalem. The one before it is the ministry in Galilee. The one after it is Jesus' time in Jerusalem, in which he ends up dying on the cross and rising. So this is the journey to Jerusalem. The journey to Jerusalem also begins with a person who cannot see. People bring a man who cannot see to Jesus, and Jesus spits in some mud, spits in some dust, and makes mud out of his saliva and the dust. And he puts the mud on the guy's eyes, and the guy can see a little bit. He can see people walking around, but they look like trees, So it hasn't really worked the way Jesus wanted it to. It hasn't completed the job. So Jesus gives it another go. And then the guy can see. He sees a little bit, and then he sees some more. Well, right after that, Peter kind of sees Jesus. The disciples don't really see Jesus very well in this section of the Gospel of Mark, but Peter kind of sees who Jesus is, because right after that, Jesus asks his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter says, "You're the Messiah." And this is true. Jesus is the Messiah, the one anointed to bring God's power and presence and peace and wholeness into the world. Well, right after that, Jesus tells his disciples what it means for him to be the Messiah. He says the Son of Man will be rejected by the chief priests and elders and the scribes and suffer greatly and be killed, and on the 3rd day rise. This is a shock to Peter and the rest of the disciples, because they have been expecting to see a Messiah who would lead them from glory into glory, from victory into victory. This was the expectation of the Messiah that was written down at that time by Jewish scribes. That was what they expected to see. And Jesus changed their expectations. Peter is so shocked that he rebukes Jesus. Jesus turns around and he rebukes Peter and he says, "You're not thinking the way God thinks. You're thinking the way people think, because God thinks differently than people think. God thinks differently than a path from victory to victory and glory to glory." Jesus gets everybody together and he says, "Listen, Christianity is not a spectator sport, okay? It's not where we stand over here and praise Jesus over there and we don't do anything. Christianity is where we take up our crosses and follow Jesus." Luther talked about this. He talked about the theology of the cross and the journey of the cross. So for the rest of the section of the Gospel of Mark, for the rest of the journey to Jerusalem, Jesus is trying to teach his disciples what it means to follow the cross. And one of the things we find out is that when we confront evil, we don't just do it on our own. We don't do it on our own power, not as individuals or as a community. We need the power of God. And so sometimes we have to get down on our knees and pray when we're confronting evil. And then he says about people who are confronting evil, but they aren't a part of our group or our denomination or our class or our nation. He says, if somebody is confronting evil, is casting out demons, and they're not against us, then they're for us. So don't stop them. 3 weeks ago, we heard about how Jesus expressed concern for some of the people in his society who were on the edges, on the boundaries, who did not have as much power as everyone else. And so he addresses the situation of women who are divorced, which puts you in a very dangerous position in Jesus' day. If your husband divorced you, it could do that. And then Jesus lifts up children as important, when in his day, children had no importance, no legal standing outside of the family. And then 2 weeks ago, Jesus expresses the situation, the realities between wealth and poverty. So Jesus is calling us to be concerned with folks who are on the edges, who are on the boundaries, who are not as powerful as we are. And throughout the journey, Jesus has predicted his death and resurrection 3 times. 3 times he will be crucified and rise. And right after he mentions the 3rd time he predicts his death and resurrection, James and John come to Jesus. And Pastor Scott shared with us last week about how James and John come to Jesus. They say, "Jesus, what do you want? Jesus, will you do for us what we ask?" And Jesus says, "What do you want me to do for you?" And James and John, after all of this, they still say, "We want to sit at your right hand and at your left hand when you come into your glory." Ladies and gentlemen, congratulations. You have found the path to glory. The way people think, not the way God thinks. So Jesus gets everybody together again. He says, "Listen, the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their leaders exercise tyranny and domination with respect to them. But it will not be so among you. Among you, the greatest shall be the least, and the leader will be the servant." So that all the different kinds of power that we have, power in our families, power in our communities, financial power, political power, military power, police power, popularity power, persuasion power, all those kinds of power are not ends unto themselves so that we can just keep power. They are tools to be used always to serve. People talk about the power of God, the authority of God, the dominion of God, the overwhelming almightiness of God, and yet God's power comes from servanthood. Jesus says, "For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." If we're a Christian, we exercise leadership. We exercise it out of servanthood. Now, this ransom thing, Jesus says he gives his life as a ransom for many. A ransom was the money that you paid in order to buy someone's freedom when they are enslaved. A ransom was the money you paid your enemy in warfare in order to get your prisoners of war back. Otherwise, they would be sold into slavery. The implication being that we are enslaved. If not in body, then in mind. And not physically, then in our sight. Because our vision and our thinking is bound by the lies and illusions of the way that human beings function. They are bound by glory and domination. The idea that our safety lies only in our ability to threaten, that our dignity lies in our status. Jesus sets us free to follow the journey of the cross, the journey of hope, the journey of God's joy. Now, immediately after all of that, okay, now comes the story of Bartimaeus. And unlike the disciples who think they know so much but only know a little bit, Bartimaeus, at least he knows he's blind. Bartimaeus, at least he knows he can't see. Bartimaeus is a beggar by the side of the road. In many ways, Bartimaeus is the ideal disciple. And in many ways, we, the church, are like Bartimaeus. Luther wrote, the last thing he wrote before he died, he was writing about interpretation of Scripture, how we understand who God is, how we understand the way God sees things, the way God thinks. And he says, the very last words, "We are beggars." That is true. We are tiny, mortal, dependent upon the grace of God. Bartimaeus cries out to Jesus. And what does he cry out for? It would be understandable if he cried out for money because he's a beggar and he could use some money so that he could eat. "Jesus, Son of David, will you please give me $1 million?" This would be understandable. Okay? "Jesus, Son of David, will you take vengeance on all the people that look down on me because I'm a beggar and I can't see? Jesus, will you take vengeance on all the people that don't treat me right because they think there's something wrong with me because I am different from them? Jesus, will you give me some glory and people bow down to me?" It's not what he asks. What does he say? "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy." The most powerful thing in all the universe. Mercy. For 20 centuries, we, the church, have been saying the same thing. Lord, have mercy. Christ, have mercy. Lord, have mercy. People try to get Bartimaeus to quiet down. Shh, he's making a ruckus. Shh. He will not be an asset to our congregation. He will not help our movement to move forward into victory. He will be an anchor. He will drag us down. Don't let him get too much into the community. He'll be a problem, I tell you. But Bartimaeus, like a good disciple, does not quit. Does not stop, is persistent, and he keeps on crying even louder, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy. Jesus, Son of David, have mercy." You know, outside here on our sign, such as it is, humble as our sign is, without like fireworks and sparkles, but it says, all welcome. Okay, when we decided to put that on the sign, we talked about it at council. We didn't just put it up there. And I said to council, do not put that up there unless you mean it. Don't put it up there unless you mean it. Okay, because some churches, they don't have a sign that says all welcome up there. That's okay. They may have theological or scriptural commitments that prevent them from being fully welcome to everybody. They're wrong, but they may have it. And they have integrity. They have integrity, right? Disagree, but integrity. Don't be putting a sign like that up there unless you mean it. Because some churches put a sign like that, say, all welcome. You come in, and yes, you're welcome to come in, but you can't read. You're welcome to come in, but you can't teach Sunday school. You're welcome to come in, but you can't be a pastor. Don't put it up there unless you mean it. Jesus tells his disciples, his own disciples, that have been trying to get Bartimaeus to be quiet and go away. He tells his own disciples to go over there and call him forward. Jesus gets us to come to you. Some of you may have felt at one time or another that you weren't welcome in the church, that you didn't have a place. And Jesus sends all of us to say, take heart. Take heart. Jesus is calling you to be here. Jesus is calling you to be here. Bartimaeus springs up and he throws his cloak aside. Little bitty detail, but he has like nothing at all in the whole world. He's a beggar. He has nothing, and yet he throws his cloak aside. When 2 weeks ago we heard about a guy who couldn't give up his many, many possessions. Bartimaeus has very few. He gives up his cloak and he runs to Jesus. What do we have to give up to run to Jesus? What ideas, what pride, what practices, what addictions, what fears? Comes Jesus. And Jesus says the same thing that he says to James and John. He says, what do you want me to do for you? And Bartimaeus says, Lord, I would like to see again. I think that's why we come to church. Because we've glimpsed something out there, most of us. Maybe just even in the form of curiosity, but we have glimpsed something powerful and beautiful and holy and terrifying and life-giving. And we want to see again. We want to see. This is what it means to be a Reformation church. We, 500 years ago, turned back towards an emphasis on salvation by grace through faith, and we cling to that truth. But that's not all there is to see. And nowadays, we walk a journey of growing and understanding in our time and our place what it means to be a Christian, what it means to carry the cross, what it means to follow Jesus. And so we continually pray to Jesus, Jesus, will you please help us to see? Thanks be to God.